Okay, college sports, one of my favorite topics. This is chapter 11. It's our last chapter that we will go over in the textbook. Let me get this started here. There we go. This chapter starts with the background of the NCAA itself. You have probably heard the NCAA referred to as a cartel, or if you're a college sports fan or follow the business of sports, you might have heard that in the past. Our cartel operates like a trust. Remember, we talked about trusts in the past in your history classes. You might have heard Teddy Roosevelt referred to as the trust buster. Essentially, these are just separate organizations that coordinate their actions together. The word itself, trust, comes from these corporations, oil companies, that in the early part of the 1900s, they had the same people on their board of trustees. So that's where we use this trust, and Teddy Roosevelt decided that was bad for consumers and bad for capitalism and the private marketplace, restricted competition, and so he busted up those trusts. So a cartel is somewhat like that, and the reason people call the NCAA a cartel is you've got these different universities all colluding or coordinating their actions, right? Otherwise, the universities are independent. GBQ Cincinnati, I have no idea what that is. All right. So the NCAA was formed essentially because there was too much violence in football. This was also happening around Teddy Roosevelt's time, the early 1900s. Players were dying. I think 18 players died in 1908, I think it was, something like that. I think I have it here in my notes. 1905, 18 players died. That's a lot of players because there wasn't near as many college football teams as we have today, and if 18 players died in a season, you can imagine that would be a tragedy. Well, if one player dies, it's a tragedy, but 18, it's a mass tragedy. So when this happened in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt said, hey, we're either going to have to ban football, or you're going to have schools, you're going to have to band together, come together, and figure out rules, codify the rules for football so that it's a little bit safer. And in doing so, they also codified the rules for other sports as well. Later, a couple decades later, the NCAA banned athletic scholarships. They called it the Sanity Code. So schools had started offering free tuition to athletes, initially football players, because they wanted their football team to be better. And the NCAA decided that this was not something that was good for amateurism. But there were 7 colleges that just refused not to offer athletic scholarships. They just kept offering them. And within the structure of the NCAA, 2/3 of the schools had to vote to expel these cheating members, and they couldn't get that vote to pass. Excuse me. And so they essentially levied no penalty against these 7 sinners, as they were called. And so you can see where that kind of created a little bit of questioning of, does the NCAA really have any authority here? And so the Sanity Code really held no teeth after that happened. And so the organization decided, well, I guess we will allow athletic scholarships. And then in 1956, as you see there on the screen, they allowed them regardless of whether an athlete needed that compensation or not. And in 1967, scholarships could be withdrawn or revoked when the student athlete no longer plays in the sport, which was controversial, right? Because now you're really tying a connection to that athlete's participation in the sport and whether you're going to pay for their school, right? So why is that such a problem? Well, I skipped ahead a little. Well, part of the issue, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, this creates a legal issue. So you're getting closer and closer to these individuals being paid for performance in a sport, right? And if you're paying somebody to do a task, they're an employee, and employees in our legal environment have certain benefits that accrue to them, such as workers' compensation. If I get hurt while under your employment, then you are somewhat liable for some benefits to come to me because I was trying to do work for you, right? So the colleges are essentially trying to kind of get around this, and that's where the term student-athlete came from. It's actually a legal term that is different from an employee, and the NCAA worked to make that legal distinction so that they wouldn't have to pay workers' compensation suits. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. So a little history behind it. I just threw this in here because we're obviously at NKU and lots of Kentucky fans, University of Kentucky fans that is, and they showed up in this chapter with some point shaving. The program gets banned. SMU in football, some of you might have seen the 30 for 30, what's it called? Pony Express is the 30 for 30 documentary about SMU and how they got the death penalty in football, meaning they were not allowed to play football for an entire year, which pretty much kills your program because you can't recruit players if you're not allowed to play. The NCAA, a big milestone was 1950 when they negotiated a TV contract. At that time, the NCAA represented all of their schools, and they restricted programs to 3 TV games every 2 years, which seems crazy in today's world, but they were really worried about attendance at the games, thinking that this new medium of TV, everyone would watch the games on TV if they were available, and no one would come to the games. As you can imagine, some of these bigger programs did not like that restriction because they felt like they could sell out their games and they could get the TV coverage and promotion that came with that. So a bunch of the big schools, led by the University of Oklahoma, sued the NCAA and eventually won that case in the 80s, and that's what gave them the right to sell their own TV games. And they decided, along with the other schools, that they were best off selling that, not individually, but as a conference. So now we see, in the case of Oklahoma, the Big 12 sells the rights to Oklahoma games, right? The rights to Kentucky games are sold by the SEC, the Southeastern Conference. In schools, this removed the market restriction that the NCAA had artificially put in place a long time ago with their TV contract restrictions, TV appearance restrictions. And we saw schools try and maximize their televised games, right? They stopped worrying about attendance and said, hey, if I can get on TV more people will see me, then maybe they will become fans of my program, or more high school athletes might see me play. Parents of high schoolers or junior high kids might get them see my program and get exposure to my program, and that might help me from a recruiting standpoint as well. So that's what we see now as schools maximizing their number of TV appearances. So getting back to the cartel, the most famous cartel that you've probably heard of in our current economic landscape is OPEC, right? OPEC restricts oil output, and they do so in a manner to control price. So you see in the map here the OPEC countries. The United States is not one of those countries. We produce oil, but outside of OPEC. And the way that a traditional cartel like OPEC works is the most efficient cartel member produces the output and is the sole producer of the output until their production reaches inefficiency levels that make them equally efficient as the next most efficient. And then that organization starts producing output, right? And because they're all bound together, that second most efficient organization agrees to this. And they say, okay, we're not going to produce any output. We're going to let this other member that's more efficient produce the output. But we're all going to sort of share in the profits collectively as a cartel. So in football, or in the NCAA's case, it doesn't operate like that, obviously, right? Ohio State does not produce football produce 12, 13, 14 games until they reach an efficiency level where then it makes sense for Ohio University and Bowling Green and Miami University and these other non-Power 5 conferences that are less efficient at producing football, then they start producing, right? That's not how it works in this case. So in that way, the NCAA is not like a strict cartel. They do collude and they decide on actions collectively, but from a production standpoint, they don't restrict output to the most efficient member. Here's a graph. If you're teaching an economics class, you have to show by contract a graph every 6 slides, and I've gone 5 slides without a graph, so here's your graph. Just kidding. But from a visual standpoint, if you're a visual learner, you can look at this graph, and I got to get my trusty pen here. Let's use green. I like green. Got my green shoes on. Don't know if you could see those, but I've even got a green soda that somebody gave me here. It's not beer. It's Jones soda. It's really not very good, but anyway. So in this graph, we have 2 firms, Firm A and Firm B. We've got a marginal cost line for each one of those firms. And we've got a marginal revenue line here for certain quantities of output, and we've got a demand line here. Notice here, this is just a graph of what I just explained. So the marginal cost line for Firm A overlaps with, this is the marginal cost of the cartel. The C is cartel itself, right? So they overlap at all of these quantities. Here's the quantity axis, right? Quantity of output. So they overlap each other out to this quantity of output. And at this particular point, we see that Firm B can start producing output, meaning Firm A and Firm B are equally efficient once Firm A has produced this level of output here. Okay? So Firm B starts producing. So this production gets added to Firm A over here, see? And we see the cartel line deviates from Firm A because now we have 2 firms producing for the cartel, right? It goes out this way. So that's what this graph is showing us. And if we look at this quantity line, we see the quantity of the cartel where marginal cost crosses marginal revenue. This is our equilibrium point in the case of the cartel. We see that quantity consists of what the quantity that B produced and the quantity that A produced. The difference is that this amount is added to what A produced, and that's what this is. Maybe I should have used different colors here. Are you confused yet? Hopefully you're not too confused. The important point here is simply that the most efficient, what I was describing on the slide before, this is just graphing the most efficient member of the cartel is going to produce output until they reach a point where a second member is equally efficient, then that member starts producing, and that increases the production of the cartel in total, right? So monopsony, we talked about that just in the last chapter when we talked about labor markets and a single buyer in the labor market. We talked about the effect that had. Here we're just using that in a different context. Same graph that we've already looked at as applied in a professional context. Excuse me. The important points here is that any monopsony or single buyer of labor, as the NCAA is going to drive down the cost of labor, right? Remember when we were talking about professional sports, we were saying when there's a rival league, salaries go up, right? When there's no rival league, I hesitate to say that NFL players are underpaid, but if there was a viable second NFL league, we would see NFL salaries go up. That's what a monopsony does, and that's what happened with the USFL in football. So, in addition to driving down the cost of labor, because there's only a single buyer in the marketplace of labor, it also creates restrictions on player movements, because the NCAA can create these restrictions. So you can't just transfer whenever you want from Ohio State to Kentucky. There's restrictions of when you can transfer and penalties to that transfer. So that's being restricted in this monopsony market. And we also know that you're going to have less total labor in the marketplace than if it was a competitive market. This is labor in a competitive market, labor in a monopsony. This is wages in a competitive market, wages in a monopsony. Okay? All right, so the NCAA, we've already talked about it as a cartel. We can think about it more generally as kind of being this club, right? And the club is subdivided. Originally, there was 3 divisions. Probably before most of you were born or started following college sports, Division I had split already into what used to be one single A and one double A, but now we call it FBS, Football Bowl Subdivision, and FCS, Football Championship Subdivision. And the reason for this, and then there's one AAA, which is what NKU is in, so that is a Division I school with no football. The reasons for the split, money, right? So it gets back to what we talked about several chapters ago when a league is trying to decide if they want to expand, right? So in this case, it's a division. So instead of the division expansion decision, here divisions are deciding to contract or to split within each other, right? The same economic rules apply, right? The reason that they want to split is you've got certain members of the division that are making a lot of money, a lot more money than other members of the division, and they're like, we don't want to share this money. Like, Miami of Ohio is not producing that much revenue compared to Ohio State. So Ohio State's thinking, I don't really want to share my revenues across the division, right? I want to create a subdivision. And now we'll see what happens, because even though we've got FBS and FCS, even within FBS, you've got the Power 5 conferences, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, SEC, and ACC, right? Those are our Power 5 conferences. Then you've got the Group of 5, which are the other NCAA, FBS conferences that are not in the Power 5. So the MAC would fall into that, Mountain West, the WAC, the Sun Belt, and I'm forgetting one. ACC, or the AAC, University of Cincinnati's conference, the American Conference, is the other one. So it'll be interesting to see, do those eventually split into subdivisions, right? Because we know that, and we'll look at an example here even before college football playoff started, we know that there's a lot more revenue in those Power 5 leagues than there is in the Group of 5 leagues. So just, and this is a rather drastic example, but think about marginal revenue and marginal cost. We know that a league is going to expand when the additional club that they're going to add, or the additional team that they're going to add, brings more marginal revenue than marginal cost, right? Or at least equal, right? They're not going to expand if marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue that's coming in from this new member, right? So there's very small marginal benefit. So marginal revenue would be included, or any other benefit of adding the fan base to the conference. There's very small marginal benefit of adding Mount St. Joe's, for example. But if a conference could add Ohio State, any conference would take that, right? There's lots of revenue associated with that, and it would be worthwhile to take it, even though you would have to split conference revenues with another school. That school is bringing more to the table than they're taking away in their share. So college sports accounting. So this can be a little bit tricky, right? You probably already realize almost all the revenue comes from football and men's basketball. There are a few exceptions, of course. There's some women's basketball programs that make money. Notre Dame, definitely Tennessee, UConn, of course. Baylor, I think, makes some money there. But for the most part, and there's some ice hockey programs that make money, and there's some baseball programs that make money. But as a general rule, football and men's basketball are the revenue-producing sports, or where revenue exceeds costs, I should say. Ticket sales are about a quarter of revenue. TV is where the big difference has happened and the big growth has happened over the last 15 years or 10, even 10. And this growing share of the revenue coming from TV has created an equal playing field within conferences, meaning there used to be more disparity in the Big Ten between Ohio State and Purdue in revenue. Now, Purdue is making a lot more money. Ohio State's making more money. And even though Ohio State still makes more money than Purdue, the disparity is not as wide as it once was because they've both gotten a lot richer, right? However, it has created more disparity between conferences, right? So whereas when I worked in college athletics, first at Ohio State and then later at Miami, which is a MAC school, right, a group of 5 conference schools, there was definitely a gap between what was at that point called the BCS conferences, or the Power 5 conferences, and the Group of 5 conferences. There was definitely a gap there. But that gap has gotten much, much wider because those Power 5 conferences have just gotten these huge TV contracts, in some cases their own networks, which has enabled them to make a lot of money. And there's just not the demand for the Group of 5 sports that makes the TV contract as valuable, or the opportunity for them to formulate their own league and get a lot of cable TV monies from that and advertising revenue from that. So keep in mind, the NCAA and their schools are not trying to maximize profit. They're trying to maximize revenue, and then they're going to convert that revenue into expenses, which typically happens in new facilities or money to coaches, because these, for the most part, these athletic programs are non-profit, if you will, right? Meaning they're not paying out profit to owners or shareholders, right? So they're going to take their revenues and spend it. They're going to create expenses, right? So why is it considered a drain on university resources? Well, in a lot of cases, it's because the revenue that's coming in is coming from student fees or elsewhere in the university budget, meaning there's some sort of subsidy that is a large part of the revenue for a vast majority of these schools, right? We're not talking about your major schools, like Ohio State does not need student fees, Michigan does not need student fees, but there's only 30 schools or so that fall into that area that do not need student fees, right, to operate, to break even. A vast majority of schools need some sort of university subsidy just to get close to breaking even. This related party transactions, I'll give you a quick story that exemplifies it. So when I worked at Miami, I was the marketing director. I had an assistant director that worked for me. I had a full-time coordinator or full-time intern. I had a GA. I had a marketing budget of about a little over $100,000, which isn't that much, but still considerable, right? So in total, that all of those expenses, my salary, my staff salary, our advertising budget, none of it showed up in the athletic department as an expense on their balance sheet, because all of those expenses showed up in the university budget under university communications. And they would justify it by saying that, hey, marketing our athletic programs is just another avenue to market our university or communicate about the benefits of our university, right? And so in that way, even though I worked for the athletic department, my office was in the basketball arena, all I worked on was sports, college sports events. In that way, it made it look like the athletic department did not have quite the burden or the expenses that it probably really did. But there was some legitimacy to it. Certainly that's true. One of the benefits of having an athletic program is to get students, alumni, faculty engaged and proud of the university as part of their identity, right? March Madness. So the key takeaways here, it's a huge contract, of course. Notice this is a B with a meaning $1 billion. It provides 90% of the NCAA's revenue, as an institution, and that 90% comes from 40% of the March Madness contract, right? So 40% of the March Madness contract the NCAA keeps, and that represents 90% of their revenue. The other 60% gets allocated back to colleges through conferences. Conference payments are based on team performance, meaning conference payments from the NCAA. So every time, if you're at a conference and every time one of your conference teams wins a March Madness game, the conference gets $250,000 each year for the next 6 years, right? So in that way, they've kind of equalized it. What they've tried to do is keep it from being peaks and valleys based on you have a good team one year, you get all this money, and then you don't have a good team for several years, right? So they spread the money out in that way so that it's easier for conferences and schools to sort of budget. But it also means that it pays literally to be in a good conference, right? Even if your team's not very good, which is one reason that NKU wanted to move the Horizon League, right? Horizon is a better basketball conference. Yes, Mercer, when they were in the Atlantic Sun, they upset Duke, right? That was huge for the Atlantic Sun. Florida Gulf Coast made a good run for the Atlantic Sun several years ago. But in general, Horizon League teams are more competitive in the tournament, and they get more money because of it. So what about bowl games? What about football? Well, football certainly sort of drives the train economically, if you will. Bowl games started as tourist attractions, the Rose Bowl being the most famous. But TV sort of changed the game, no pun intended, the TV contract. So ESPN owns a lot of the bowls now. That's why you will see bowls in crazy places with not very many people in the stands. But ESPN wants that bowl because they can sell it as a package with their other bowls to sponsors and advertisers, right? And it makes for a more attractive package for ESPN to sell. So that's why we've had this proliferation of bowls, if you will. You should know the BCS, which doesn't exist anymore, now we have the College Football Playoff. Neither of those were NCAA organizations. Those were run by the conferences in collaboration with the TV networks that set that up. They're trying to maximize essentially TV ratings, which means maximizing TV rights fees for the conferences. The Power 5 conferences have always earned a lot more, whether it's under BCS or whether it's under the College Football Playoff or even before that. Here we see an example from your textbook. It's pretty easy to see where the line is here between the haves and the have-nots, right? Pretty big disparity between these two, right? And important to note, this is the old Big East that included UC in its last couple years. Not the Big East basketball conference that we think of now. Costs of college athletics. Scholarships are the biggest cost. So in an athletic department, you have to pay the university, transfer money to the university for all of your scholarship athletes. You have to transfer their tuition dollars. Economists would say, I don't know if this is really a legitimate cost, because how much does it cost the university to educate each individual student? You know, only if the university is at capacity is there really a significant marginal cost to having another athlete sitting in the class, right? Or a athlete sitting in your class. You know, whether I teach a class that has 15 people in it or 35 people in it, I get paid the same, right? So there's no additional cost to the university, and as long as the classroom's big enough, the marginal cost is essentially zero of having an additional person in the class. So in that way, they're saying, this is, you know, not necessarily a legitimate transfer payment, but it happens, right? It's the way that athletic departments are set up and operate within universities. And on the flip side, as we talked about, universities, almost all universities will subsidize their athletic department through student fees or other manner of doing so. Sometimes by taking expenses off of their books, right? Like the example that I gave. So there's a limited opportunity cost, I guess you could say, to having a student athlete in the classroom versus another student, a paid student in that classroom. as long as your college is not at full capacity in terms of their classroom, right? Because then a student athlete taking up a seat is literally taking a seat that a paid student would otherwise take, right? But if you've got extra seats in that classroom, the paid students can be in and the student athlete. So this graph, I know you can't see it that well, or chart, but I'll describe it for you. It's just a quick chart, gives you a visual of where a lot of this revenue goes in terms of the cost, meaning to pay football coaches or basketball coaches, football or men's basketball. So all the yellow states here, the highest paid state employee in that state is a football coach. Okay, so you see lots of yellow states there. Any state that is orange, the highest paid state employee in the entire state is a basketball coach, right? Minnesota, you could see they have equal. Their football and basketball coaches are paid the same, and they are tied for the highest paid employee. The blue is some other state employee other than football or basketball coach. So you see not very many blue states here. Capital expenditures exceed operating expenses usually. Capital expenditures being stadium improvements, facility improvements, building a new dorm for student athletes, building a academic center for student athletes. Those would all be capital expenditures. Operating expenses are like your year-on-year operating expenses, of which scholarships is the largest single item. But your advertising budget would be an operating expense. Your stadium electric bill would be an operating expense. But we have to keep in mind that even in the bowl football subdivision, athletics is just about 4% of the university budget, right? So we give it a lot of attention in the media and as fans, but the university is much larger than just the athletic program. So let's somewhat keep it in perspective in that regard. So this chart is not from your book. It's one I found. I was trying to represent this graphically, and I found this one. So this does not count university allocations, right, in this chart. It includes, the chart itself does not count university allocations. If you include university allocations, 72% of BCS schools are profitable, right? But again, we're including the subsidy from the university. And by profitable, we mean they take in more revenue than they have expenses. If we only count athletic revenue, so that's what you're seeing in this chart, less than 30% are profitable. Now, we're not seeing every school in this chart because it'd just be too many logos. All we're seeing in this chart are the mostly BCS schools, although there's a couple other ones like Army is in here, Boise State is in here, but there's no MAC schools in this chart or anything like that. So we see even within the largest programs, anything in green means the program is profitable. They take in more revenue than expenses, and the amount of revenue that they take in is represented by the horizontal axis here, right? So Texas is the program that takes in the most revenue in this particular year. You see followed by Ohio State, Michigan, Alabama, Florida, right? All of these schools. We could probably draw a nice little circle here, and we would have pretty much the most powerful athletic departments. They're taking in lots of revenue, and they're not spending near as much. So Auburn, it's taking in a lot of revenue, but it's spending a lot, right? So we see that it's just at kind of the break-even point here. As we move down, out here we got Kansas State. Kansas State is not taking in as much revenue, but they're not spending as much either. I don't know what's going on with them. I don't know why they're not spending, but they're not, at least in this particular year. I think this is 2013. And you see UNLV, right? They're not taking in as much revenue as these other programs, and they are spending a ton more than they're taking in, right? Rutgers, we see spending a lot. Of course, the situation has changed for Rutgers. Now that they joined the Big Ten, they've probably moved this way somewhat. As you see, pretty much all the Big Ten schools are on this part of the graph over here. And we see some other schools. We see UC down here, right? This is the problem with them trying to get into the Power Five, is they're not producing enough revenue athletically. So the marginal revenue that they're going to add to the conference, it's not substantial enough for the conference to say that it justifies the marginal cost of adding another member. pretty much all non-BCS schools lose money. So why do they do this? If they're losing money and the university's having to allocate money just to break even, why do they do it? Well, we know as sports fans that college sports provide positive externalities, and that way they're public goods, right? They could create a sense of identity for the community. In some cases, they can add to admissions or increase admissions to the school with a successful sports program. This has been called the Flutie effect after Doug Flutie won the Heisman at Boston College. Boston College saw a huge increase in applications. There's been somewhat mixed results in other studies of this effect. Sometimes economists find it, sometimes they don't find it when they look at the data and look for correlations between number of applicants to the university and quality of those applicants and the quality of the athletic program or the success of the athletic program. Also donations, right? So you have a good sports team, maybe it increases donations to the athletic department, maybe it also increases donations to the university as a whole, right? State legislatures have a lot of power over state schools and their budgets, right? So maybe if the legislator went to certain schools and that school does well athletically, the state legislator is more likely to continue to fund that university and not cut funding for higher education in that particular state. Academic standards. We all know there's academic standards to the NCAA. We probably understand the positive aspect here, but there is some negative aspect from it if we think about it economically. By this I mean it creates this barrier to entry for programs that are not already power programs. So what do I mean by that, barrier to entry? Well, think about it. You know, you've got these established programs, right? We know that the NCAA restricts what you can pay or offer athletes and incentives, right? Excuse me. And also, by imposing these academic standards, it also restricts new entrants or people trying to raise the profile of their athletic program. It keeps them from accepting weaker students too, right? Because you have to meet some minimum standard. So in that way, it sort of props up the establishment, right? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have academic standards. Of course, I'm in favor of the positive aspect here. But we also have to recognize what other restriction that creates in terms of the structure of college athletics and it being a reinforcing the status quo, if you will, and making it more difficult for programs that are not competitive to become competitive and raise their profile athletically. So the NCAA used to use graduation rates, but there were a lot of problems with that, so they developed the academic progress rate, the APR. Some of you might have heard of this. It's sport by sport. It's not the athletic department as a whole, although lots of athletic programs will generate an overall athletic program APR rating. Here's how the point system works. 1 point if a scholarship athlete remains enrolled, 1 more point if they stay academically ineligible, and it's by term with a fall and a spring term, right? So let's look at basketball example. You've got 13 players. Each player can add 2 points to your APR. Again, 1 point if they stay enrolled and another point if they're academically eligible. And you've got 2 terms, fall and spring. So we multiply this out and we get 52 possible points, right? Let's say on your team, a player is ruled ineligible and another player drops out, right? I lose 1 point for the ineligible player. I lose 2 points for the player that drops out because they're not eligible anymore and they did not stay enrolled, right? So that's 3 points lost. So I've earned 49 out of 52 points. My team scores a 942 times, or that ratio times 100 gives me 942. The standard stated that at first you had to be at 925 for basketball team, and then they increased the standards just a couple years ago to 930. And you can see that if this was our team, we would still be in good shape, right? And then there are penalties too. If you don't meet the standard First you go on just kind of probation. You've got a year or two to increase and get back up to you get a little bit of a grace period. If you don't meet the grace period, you lose a scholarship in a year, and then you can also lose the right to participate in the NCAA postseason. That's what happened to UConn a few years ago, UConn men's team. Their APR was too low and they weren't eligible for the tournament. So we looked at this prisoner's dilemma, and we talked about it as it relates to performance-enhancing drugs a few chapters ago. It also relates to NCAA violations, right? I used the book's example of UCLA and USC. Let's say we're at USC. We have a pretty good idea that UCLA is violating NCAA rules in some way. We can also choose to violate the rules, in which case we compete on an even playing field, but we both run the risk of having bad reputations. Or we can choose to maintain the standards and play by the rules, and UCLA gets a competitive advantage over us, right? But maybe their reputation suffers for it, right? If they maintain the standards, then maybe we say, okay, we'll also maintain the standards. Again, we're on equal playing field. We both have good reputations. That's probably ideal. But maybe we're tempted. We're saying, hey, UCLA is maintaining the standards. We could cheat a little bit and get an advantage here, right? And we could perhaps dominate our rivalry with them. But if we get caught, our reputation is going to suffer. Hence Reggie Bush, right? Scholarships. Many of you have probably already thought about this a little bit. The point to take away from this in terms of maybe what you can learn in a sports economics class is what I was referring to when we first started this chapter. Scholarships create a little bit of a legal problem for universities, meaning if you're giving students some sort of financial aid, and it's not based on regardless of financial need, so it's not based on that, and it's not based on academic merit, then in some ways the students are kind of becoming employees, right? You're paying them for their athletic talent. And that could mean workers' compensation. So that's the reason the NCAA created this legal term, student-athlete. And if you're a student-athlete, you have to sign a contract for that scholarship, and that scholarship says you are not an employee. Meaning you cannot file workers' compensation. Also grants the university the right to your likeness, which is controversial in many ways. Ed O'Bannon filed a lawsuit. Some of you might have heard of this O'Bannon case over EA Sports, right? The fact that EA Sports was creating a college basketball video game and using his likeness for that game. And he was not being compensated for it. And EA Sports settled that lawsuit and actually paid out some royalties to former student-athletes whose likenesses that they used. The NCAA continued the suit as a defendant and won, and Ed O'Bannon, because of what the athlete had signed when they signed their scholarship, giving the university right to assign their likeness to a third party, being EA Sports. But Ed O'Bannon and his lawyers are currently appealing that. So economists like to measure things, right? We like to put a value on certain things. We've already talked about the NCAA having monopsony power, a single buyer of labor, and they use that power to generate economic benefits or economic rent, if you will. So how might we measure this value? Well, let's think about it in terms of the revenue produced by, say, the top 20 football programs. It's about $62 million a year per program. In collective bargaining in the NFL, about 48% of revenue goes to players, and that's how the salary cap gets set. 48% of this revenue would be about $30 million. So we'd say if we follow the same thing that was collectively bargained in the NFL, the same structure, about half the revenue would go to the players. Teams have 85 scholarships, football teams. If we just divide that 30 million by the 85, that means that every athlete would get 355 million. Pretty good chunk of change, but we know that all players are not paid the same on an NFL roster, right? So if we look at the quarterback, earns about 15% of the payroll. 15% of that 30 million would be about $4.5 million. Johnny Manziel, Johnny Money, hasn't really worked out for him. Poor Browns, wasting that first round pick. I think he was pick 22 maybe. Anyway, he wanted to see the money, right? If we were trying to put a dollar amount on that, maybe we could say about $4.5 million. Although him being a Heisman Trophy winner, he was probably worth much more than that to Texas A&M. He wasn't just any star quarterback. This is a chart from your book. I'm not going to spend much time with it, but it just shows the very low probabilities of high school athletes making it to the NCAA as a college athlete. You can see below 5% in most of these sports, or 6%. Ice hockey a little bit higher. NCAA to the professional level even lower, right? Except for in baseball, and this includes minor leagues, so that's why that number's a little higher, because we have a lot of minor leagues in baseball. High school to the professional level, of course, hardly anybody ever does that. Graduation success rates. So this is also a chart from your book, but kind of interesting to look at. This is the Sweet 16 from many years ago, 2012. We can see graduation success rate is the percent of athletes graduating within 6 years of when they enrolled. And we see the women's teams doing pretty well here. I mean, about half of the women's Sweet 16 had 100% graduation success rate. That is great. And even the worst team had 63%, which is not ideal, but could be worse, right? In this particular year, Baylor won the national championship. Brittany Grimes, I think, was the star player on that team. Looking at the men's side, not quite as successful, but still several schools in the 90s, or at least 80s. Look at the top school here, Xavier, one of our local schools in the Cincinnati metro area. We see UC made the Sweet 16 in this year. They had not quite as successful. They're only 56%. Louisville, right below them, was a Final Four team this year, also 56%. We see a couple schools having some trouble down here, right? Why is it worse for certain sports compared to others? Well, there's certainly this issue, leaving for the draft, right? If we look at Kentucky, the national championship in this particular year, 69%, I think. That's probably not too bad, considering that several of those players went to the professional level without a degree. But also it's because of the pressure to win in these sports, athletes get recruited that are probably less prepared for college in those high-pressure win environments. So that could be part of the rationale. So that's college sports. I know that was quick. I barely got it under 50 minutes. I could talk about college sports forever. I think it's highly interesting. And maybe we can have a discussion about it at some point if you would like. Of course, feel free to email me with any questions. But that's pretty much the end of our text. We will start to move into the Moneyball book now for the rest of our class.